The call came while I was still in uniform. "Ma'am, your stepfather is here. He has an industrial grinder." For a moment, the world went very quiet. Not because I was afraid, but because I'd been waiting for this exact sentence. For years, I could picture him standing in front of that downtown container, jaw tight, hands shaking with entitlement, convinced that whatever my father left behind belonged to him now. I didn't raise my voice. I smiled and looked at the clock. "Let him grind, Thomas," I said. "He just triggered the 48-hour security protocol my father established. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community in this journey toward justice." I didn't panic. Panic is a luxury for the unprepared, and in naval intelligence, being unprepared is a death sentence. I sat at my workstation, the blue glow of the military-grade monitor reflecting in my eyes, and I entered the override command. Most people think a maritime container is just a box of corrugated steel. Bradley thought enough friction and heat would grant him entry to $12 million of my father's blood and sweat. He was wrong. That container was a digital and physical fortress lined with a jewel-layered reinforced alloy that could withstand a breach for days. I knew what people whispered. Back in Savannah, they thought I was the cold, distant daughter who'd let a predator walk into her mother's life and raid the family pantry. They saw my silence during the wedding as a surrender. My lack of protest when Bradley started reorganizing the house as a sign of weakness. But in my world, silence is the ultimate preparation. It is the tactical pause before an ambush. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for too long, watching Bradley foot his greed through my mother's grief. I didn't warn her, and I didn't fight him when he first moved in. I just watched. In the intelligence community, we call it baiting the kill zone. You don't stop a predator when he first starts sniffing around. You let him commit. You wait until he steps so far into the trap that his only way out is a full confession. My compassion had been a luxury Bradley had overdrafted for months, thinking my military service had made me rigid and unobservant. He didn't realize it had actually turned me into a human ledger. This is the survivalist silence. The understanding that you don't fight every battle as it comes. You choose the one that ends the war. Every time he asked about my father's retirement accounts or searched for a hidden will, I added a line to the balance sheet. Every time he suggested my mother liquidate my father's unused assets to simplify their lives, I noted the intent. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. It was a series of zeros and ones on a secure screen. Now I realized it had been a subscription to a lie, with me footing the bill, and the cancellation was long overdue. As the lockdown protocol initiated, I watched the remote feed from the Dockland. I could see the sparks flying from Bradley's grinder in the heavy Georgia mist, illuminating his face with a desperate, greedy heat. He looked small. He looked like an amateur, trying to decode a masterwork. He didn't realize that my father, Gary, had anticipated this exact moment of entitlement. My father believed that if you loved someone, you didn't leave them confusion, you left them clarity. Inside, my terminal glowed with a different kind of sunrise. The kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I had 48 hours to get to Savannah, and by the time I landed, the debt Bradley owed would be collected in full. I didn't close my eyes on the flight to Savannah. I watched the coastline blur beneath the wing of the transport plane, a jagged line of gray and deep blue that mirrored the datasets I'd been auditing for hours. My father, Gary, had built an empire on that coast, a $25 million Dockland business, forged from iron, salt water, and a level of grit that a man like Bradley couldn't even simulate. My father's hands were a map of his labor, calloused and scarred from decades of pulling life out of the Atlantic. Bradley's hands, by contrast, were soft, manicured, and expressive only when they were reaching for something that didn't belong to him. He had appeared in my mother's life less than a year after the funeral, introducing himself as Bradley Smith, a humble widower who spoke in low, rehearsed tones of shared grief. He walked into our home with flowers and performative respect, but I saw the way his eyes calculated the square footage of the mahogany floors. While he offered my mother a shoulder to cry on, to my mother, Stephanie, he was a lifeline. To me, he was a ghost in a cheap suit, a shadow lengthening over everything my father had built. I remembered sitting on the back porch with my father, just weeks before the end. He had been a man of silence, believing that words were often just noise, meant to distract from intent. He told me then that some things shouldn't live in the house, because they are too important to be misunderstood. I used to think he was paranoid, leaving me a heavy brass key and a set of coordinates to a container at the far end of the docks. Now, I recognized it as his final act of protection. This was the Guardian's silent regret. My father had seen Bradley circling long before I did. He had watched the way this man looked at our accounts and our legacy while the light was still in my father's eyes. He could have stopped it then, but he chose a different route. He left the container as a final exam, a tactical training ground, where I would have to learn to defend the family gate myself. He knew that if he just gave me money, Bradley would eventually find a way to bleed it dry. But if he gave me a secret and a fortress, I would have to become the officer he raised me to be. Bradley had spent months weaving a narrative of my distance, telling my mother that my time in naval intelligence had made me secretive and difficult. He reframed my father's legacy as a burden that needed to be liquidated for my mother's peace of mind. He thought he was isolating her, but he was actually just providing me with a high-definition map of his greed. Every lie he told was a line item I archived. Every manipulation was a debt he didn't know he was accruing. The $12 million in that container represented the liquid hearts of my father's $25 million empire. It wasn't just a figure on a balance sheet, it was the physical manifestation of my father's foresight. Bradley thought the grinder was his key to a quick payout. He didn't understand that he wasn't breaking into a bank. He was breaking into a trap, designed by a man who had spent his whole life watching the tides. My father didn't leave me confusion, he left me the equity of truth. And it was time for the final audit. Bradley was a professional. He didn't just walk into my mother's life. He staged an invasion under the guise of an evacuation. He called himself Bradley Smith, a name so common it was practically a camouflage. My father had once said that a man who uses an overly common name is usually trying to hide a very specific past. From my station, I had already begun a baseline check. Bradley Smith didn't seem to exist in any public records. Prior to 2015, he was a digital ghost who had built a persona out of paper-thin sincerity and borrowed grief. He used my mother's widowhood like a tactical opening. Stephanie was fragile, a woman whose entire world had been anchored by my father's steady, quiet strength. When Gary died, that anchor was gone, as she was left drifting in a sea of overwhelming quiet. Bradley provided the rescue. He was the one who held her hand during those long, lonely Sunday afternoons. He was the one who whispered that it was time to let go of the past, while his eyes were busy inventorying the silver and scanning the room for any sign of a vault. But his most lethal move wasn't his charm. It was the way he began to rewrite our history. He started planting seeds of doubt in my mother's mind, using my uniform as a barrier between us. He told her that my time in the military had made me rigid and secretive. He reframed my father's decision to leave me in charge of the maritime container as a sign of Gary's lingering distrust toward her. Why would Gary hide $12 million from his own wife? He would ask her, his voice dripping with performative concern, unless your daughter convinced him you weren't capable of handling the family legacy. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. He was the one hunting for a payout, but he made me look like the thief. He convinced her that I was hoarding family funds at the base, using my father's sweat to finance a life of secrets she wasn't a part of. He made my tactical silence look like a criminal conspiracy. By the time I received that call from the Dockland, he had already convinced my mother that breaking into that container wasn't a crime, it was an act of financial justice. He told her he was doing it for her. To uncover the resources she was being denied, I watched her face through our weekly video calls, and I saw the shift. The warmth I'd known my whole life was being replaced by a guarded, painful apprehension. She looked at me, not as her daughter, but as an obstacle to the security Bradley promised. Bradley was always there, standing just out of the camera's frame, a predator disguised as a protector. He thought he had successfully isolated the narrative. He thought he had turned the one person Gary loved against the one person Gary trusted. He didn't realize that in the world of intelligence, we don't just watch the target, we watch the people the target tries to influence. Every lie he whispered into her ear was a line item I archived. Every manipulation was a signature on his own death warrant. He thought he was playing for a house. Under container, I was playing for a conviction. I touched down in Savannah, just as the morning fog began to roll off the Atlantic. The air was thick and tasted of salt and diesel, a familiar weight that used to mean home. Now, it was a deployment zone. I didn't drive to the house. Going there would have been a tactical error, giving Bradley a chance to rehearse his concerned husband routine. Instead, I drove to a nondescript office near the historic district to meet Elias. Elias had been a federal investigator for 30 years, and my father's closest friend since they were boys on the docks. He didn't offer a hug or a condolence. He offered a manila folder. In our world, information is the only currency that matters. Your father was many things, Olivia, but he was never a fool, Elias said. His voice as dry as the paperwork he was sliding across the desk. He kept records of everyone Bradley spoke to. Before Gary even got sick, he knew a predator. When he saw one, we spent the next 3 hours cross-referencing the dock surveillance with Bradley's digital footprint. It was a masterpiece of incompetence, hidden behind arrogance. Bradley had been paying off 2 harbor workers to look the other way while he attempted the breach. Bribing dock staff in a maritime trade zone isn't a family squabble. It's a federal offense. I archived the time-stumped videos of the cash handoffs and the recorded statements from the manager. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was an active criminal investigation. While Elias prepared the federal reports, I initiated the financial counterstrike, invoking my status as the successor trustee of the Gary Dockland Living Trust, a role that became active the moment my father passed. I contacted the head of security at our primary bank. I didn't ask for permission. I presented the evidence of the attempted force entry and the ongoing maritime fraud. I didn't cry, and I didn't ask why he'd done it. I simply opened my laptop and started clicking restrict. Within 12 minutes, every joint account Bradley shared with my mother was frozen under emergency suspicious activity status. My compassion had been a luxury he'd overdrafted for months. Thinking I was too distracted by my service to notice his hand in the drawer, he was about to find out that the Bank of Olivia was closed, and his credit was worthless. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. I felt a cold sense of power as the status on my screen flipped from active to restricted. Bradley thought the industrial grinder was his way into my father's life. He didn't realize that in my world, we don't just build walls, we build legal fortresses that collapse around the target before they even hear the alarm. I was no longer the daughter watching from the base. I was the officer executing a search and destroy mission on his entire reality. I sat in the dim light of Elias's office, the home of my military-grade laptop. The only sound, cutting through the heavy silence of the Savannah morning, I entered the final decryption key, the one my father had whispered to me in spirit, through his meticulous notes. The digital lock on the maritime container didn't just open, it surrendered. For years, Bradley thought the container held $12 million in liquid assets and gems. He was right, but he was also lethally wrong. He thought the value was the prize. He never realized the value was just the bait. As the files loaded, a name from the past flickered across my screen. Apex Maritime Solutions. I felt a cold wave of clarity wash over me. 2014. That was the year my father's business nearly collapsed. A ghost company had siphoned off nearly $8 million through a series of fraudulent shipping manifests and shell accounts. Gary had survived it, but it had aged him by 10 years. in a single winter. He had spent the rest of his life documenting that betrayal, waiting for the ghost to materialize again. I scrolled through the scanned IDs and the original, unredacted contracts buried in the encrypted vault. There he was, a younger version of the man, currently trying to grind his way into my father's legacy. Bradley wasn't just a gold digger who had found a grieving widow. He was a predator, returning to the scene of a decade-old crime to finish the job. He didn't marry my mother for the house or the silver. He married her because he knew Gary had kept the receipts, the original documents that could put him in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a cold case file being closed with surgical precision. My father hadn't left me a warehouse of junk. He had left me a digital gallows for the man who tried to ruin him. Bradley thought the industrial grinder was his tool for liberation. He didn't understand that every spark he threw was just a flare alerting me to his exact location in the kill zone. I stared at the screen, my eyes tracing the digital signatures that matched the man in my mother's living room. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I had been the silent investor in his version of family, allowing him to accrue a debt of lies and manipulation. Now, the audit was complete, and the interest was compounding by the second. I closed the laptop and stood up, the tactical weight of my uniform feeling more like armor than it ever had at the base. Elias looked at me, his face a mask of dockside grit. "You ready?" he asked. I touched the brass key in my pocket, the one that would actually open the container and reveal the truth Bradley was so desperate to destroy. "The file is verified, Elias," I said, my voice clinical and devoid of the heat he expected. "I'm not just ready, I'm lethal." I wasn't going to wait for the 48-hour protocol to expire. I had seen enough. It was time to return the ghost of 2014 to the sallow ground where he belonged. I walked out into the savannah fog, moving toward the house, toward the mother I needed to save, and toward the man who had no idea his entire world had just been liquidated. The sea air felt cold as I walked up the driveway of my childhood home. I didn't knock. It was my father's house, and the locks I'd remotely reset earlier that morning yielded to my code with a crisp digital click. Inside, the house was quiet, except for the low murmur of voices coming from the living room. Bradley was holding court, a glass of my father's 20-year-old scotch in his hand, leaning back in Gary's favorite leather armchair. My mother, Stephanie, sat across from him, her eyes red and her posture slumped. "It's for the best, Stephanie," Bradley was saying, his voice a perfect imitation of comfort. "Once we have the assets from that container, we can move away from this sallow air. We can start fresh without all this military-grade secrecy holding us back." I stepped into the light of the living room. "I'm afraid the fresh start just got cancelled, Bradley," I said. My voice was clinical, a flat line of sound that cut through his rehearsed sincerity like a scalpel. He jumped, the scotch slushing over the rim of the glass. The surprise on his face lasted for exactly 3 seconds, before he masked it with a sneer. "Olivia," he said, standing up, "you're making a scene. This is a family matter, and as your mother's husband, I have a right to manage our legacy." I didn't answer with words. I walked to the mahogany coffee table and set my military-grade tablet down. I hit play. The screen flickered to life. In high resolution, it was a 4K feed from the docks. There was Bradley, his face contorted with greed and sweat, struggling with an industrial grinder against the reinforced steel of the container. The audio was crisp, the screech of metal on metal, and Bradley's muffled curses as a security alarm he couldn't see began to strobe. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she watched her charming husband act like a common thief. Bradley's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. That's a violation of privacy," he hissed. "No," I corrected him. "That's a federal felony in a maritime trade zone. But we aren't done with the accounting yet." I threw a heavy manila folder onto the table next to the tablet, left it as the bait for the man who tried to ruin him. Bradley's smugness evaporated. He looked at the dossier, then at the tablet, then at the door. He was a predator who had just realized the cage bars were already locked. He started to move, to speak, to beg. But I held up Gary's final letter. "This is for you, Mom," I said, handing the envelope to Stephanie. "Dad knew. He knew you'd be lonely, and he knew a man like Bradley would use that loneliness as a doorway. He didn't want to control you. He wanted to protect your right to choose the truth." As my mother opened the letter, the sound of sirens began to wail in the driveway. The Savannah police, backed by Elias, and the federal authorities didn't need to force their way in. I had already left the door open for them. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a liquidation of every lie Bradley had ever told. The power flip was complete. He wasn't the husband or the protector. He was a trespasser on a trust I was legally bound to defend. He was a line item that was about to be permanently deleted. Justice isn't always poetic. But in Savannah, it tasted like salt air and absolute closure. Bradley, or rather, the man who spent a decade hiding from his own crimes, didn't get to charm his way out of a federal courtroom. The evidence from 2014, preserved perfectly in that $12 million container, was the final signature on his sentencing. He was prosecuted for interstate fraud, large-scale embezzlement, and property damage. The house Gary built is quiet again. The sallow air of manipulation has been cleared, replaced by the steady, honest rhythm of the tides. My mother, Stephanie, finally found her voice. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow reclamation, a realization that her loneliness wasn't a weakness for others to exploit, but a space she could choose to fill with her own strength. We opened the container together, with the key I'd guarded so closely. Inside, we didn't just find assets. We found Gary's presence in every neatly labeled file, and every carefully chosen word. I didn't keep that money for a life of luxury. That wasn't the mission. I established the Gary Legacy Fund. It's a foundation dedicated to providing maritime technical training and scholarships for the children of the dock workers who stood by my father for 40 years. It's my way of ensuring his grit and his vision outlived the greed of men like Bradley. Standing at the far end of the docks, watching the sunrise paint the Atlantic in shades of copper and gold, I finally felt the weight of my uniform lighten. The mission of the Silent Sentinel was complete. This brings me to something important, a message I want to leave with you. This is a letter to those who have always felt like the outsider in their own family, the one standing just out of the frame while others took the spotlight. Maybe you're the one everyone calls difficult or rigid because you insist on having a voice and a boundary. I want you to know that your silence isn't a surrender. It's a sanctuary. Protecting your peace isn't an act of selfishness. It's an act of honor. When you set a boundary, you're not just closing a door on someone else's toxic behavior. You're opening a door to your own future. You deserve a life that isn't a series of overdrafted compassions for people who refuse to see your worth. My father taught me that truth doesn't need an audience to be real, and justice doesn't need to be loud to be permanent. You are the guardian of your own legacy. Don't let anyone with bolt cutters tell you otherwise. Savannah is a city of ghosts, but today, as I look out over the water, I only see clarity. I can feel Gary's smile in the breeze. A quiet confirmation that the gates are secure. The ledger is balanced. The accounting is done. If the story of Olivia and the Dockland legacy gave you the courage to stand your ground, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Hit that follow button and stay with us for more journeys into the heart of justice. Let's keep walking this path together.